Right. Okay. So do I click continue? I guess.
Yeah.
I've just got continue. Yeah. I guess that's what it means. Okay. Well, first of all, Jim, thank you very much for your introduction and for inviting me to give this talk. It's a particularly interesting theme for me because it's an area that I'm trying to work with in a kind of theoretical way as well as an empirical way, trying to understand this application of language learning strategies in a different context, in a context where content is the prime motivator for most teachers, but also the prime motivator for most students. I can hear something in the background, but that's quite nice. Okay, so I've called it language learning strategies, theorizing the to EMI instruction, EMI contexts. So if we start with the origins of language learning strategies, as you can see, go back quite a long way, back to the 1970s, when people were really trying to identify, what is it about learners that seems to make them good language learners, and that's the GLL. They're often quoted. What is it about them that makes them good language learners and others less good language learners? And fed into this language learning strategies. I mean, there are various names for this: language learner strategies, language learning strategies, and so forth. But generally speaking, language learner strategies is an acceptable word for a series of words for it, title for it. As well as this came the work of Canal and Swain in 1980 and subsequently on communicative competence, where they were arguing that in order to have communicative competence in a second language and L2, you have to deploy a number of tricks, number of strategies, number of measures in order to make A, understood, and B, be able to understand in a conversation. And that was communicative competence. So, as I say, it goes back a long way and much research has been done on it. There have been a number of polemical discussions about the quality of the theorizing, which I won't go into, apart from a few aspects which affect my theorizing on English medium instruction. So this is a definition of strategies, and, which I've been using now for some time. So they are, if you look at the bits which are in color, it's about them being conscious, goal-oriented, mental actions. That's quite important. The learners deploy, often in clusters, in relation to a language use or a language learning task. These clusters of mental actions may need to be adapted as and when different task types are encountered. The strategic behavior, as I call it, will have varying degrees of intensity according to the difficulty of the task and relative to the learner's linguistic knowledge. And contributing to the level of difficulty of the task is the learner's prior knowledge of the topic. So I'll try and talk about those bits which are in color and then try and relate them to EMI as much as I can in the time given. So we look at these kinds of behaviors: reviewing vocabulary, watching English language, taking notes, writing summaries. I would probably put these down as study skills rather than strategies. And that's one of the areas that there's been a contention about what is a strategy. And you've got these kind of big things, I watch English language TV shows. Well, what do you do while you're watching those English language TV shows? So there's those I would actually classify more as basic study skills or approaches to language learning. Look at these, I choose my sources of language. I write an English journal. I practice English students. Yeah, again, I would say these are kind of general study skills or approaches to learning language. They're fine. I'm not saying that they are not to be considered, but they don't go down far enough into what's actually going on in the brain, because these study skill lists are of very little use without considering those underlying mental actions which are being used. And so here's an example of what I would actually classify very much as a strategy. You've got the keyword strategy, right? So in Italian, the word for cork, that's the thing that goes into a bottle, is tappo. And if you can't remember the word for cork, so you go English tap, make a connection between the two, then you might have a picture of a tap, then you might make a little story about if I can, yeah, come on, where are a cork going into the tap and then no water coming out, and that leads to you saying, oh dear. So you go tap, oh, yeah, tap, oh dear. I mean, I know that's, you know, a bit amusing, but it's the kind of keyword strategy that is used by, I use it myself, you know, trying to remember certain words in certain languages. So, but that is a mental action. Visual, it's got language and so on. So I would classify that as a strategy, which is sort of underlying all the other much bigger behaviors that I was talking about earlier on. Okay, what's the claims that have been made by strategy researchers? Well, the quantity and the range of strategies correlates well with proficiency and attainment. There are individual differences and group differences in language learner strategy use. I'll mention that in a minute. The methodology they claim for eliciting strategy use, although it's imperfect, is at an acceptable level of validity. I mean, methodology being problematic in the sense that you're trying to get inside people's heads, inside students' heads. So yeah, you know, it's not easy to do, but you know, think alouds and things like that do help. And generally, the evidence is that strategy-based instruction is effective in promoting learner proficiency, and by copying the good language learner, for example. And language learning strategies are used in language learning and language use, not only for learning, but also in the 4 skills. Other more refined findings, if you like, age, older learners seem to use more strategies. I don't mean by older learners my age, I mean older learners, 13, 14-year-olds rather than 4 or 5-year-olds. Females appear to use more strategies than males, but kind of slightly mixed results on that. Motivation correlates strongly with high strategy use, which is not surprising. That strategy, you know, being strategic requires a lot of effort, and therefore you need motivation to push the effort along. Some evidence of personality, extroverts use more strategies than introverts, and then there's this whole business of nationality and culture. Some evidence that certain culture use fewer strategies, but I think some of that, and I don't want to go into that today particularly. Categorizing strategy has always been a problem. Generally speaking, in the literature, it's been fairly unproblematic distinguishing between cognitive strategies, as in I visualize a word I hear, and metacognitive strategy, I plan things, I monitor what I've just done, I evaluate something I've just done, and so on. Slightly more complicated things like affective, getting into the right frame of mind, or social, I try to talk to native speakers, because again, you know, trying to talk to native speakers is a fairly big activity, and kind of clashes with my notion of getting down to the mental actions. Another little problem, in fact, quite a big problem, is the direction of causality. I'll come back to this in a moment when I'm talking about EMI, but the one question is it the variability in strategic behavior, i.e. use more of it or better strategies, that leads to better performance in language skills, or if you like, to higher proficiency in exams, or is it the other way around? Is it that somehow it's your proficiency level that allows you, gives you access to a certain number of strategies that you couldn't possibly have access to if your vocabulary was much, much lower. So I think that direction of causality is still there to be discussed at a theoretical level and at an empirical level as well. As I said, there is evidence that strategy training or strategy instruction, if carried out over a lengthy period of time, and if it's integrated well into the general curriculum, does seem to be fairly effective in promoting LT proficiency. A couple of systematic reviews and meta-analyses there do suggest a pretty good outcome of teachers, trying to get their students to be more strategic. Okay, so now we come to EMI. So how do we apply strategies to EMI? Well, this is my definition of EMI, and it's one that's been used a fair amount, and colleagues in the Department of Oxford have very kindly also adopted it. As you can see, I will just read it. Strategies are goal-oriented, mental actions. Yeah, so that's okay. That's the same as before. The learners deploy often in the class in relation to language use. Now, if language use is the archetypal version of strategy use, if you like, in an EMI context, because a definition of EMI is the use of the English language to teach academic subjects. You see, what I'm trying to say here is that the use of the English language rather than, learning the language itself. So that becomes a very important part of that definition of strategies. This is nevertheless, problematic. This definition has to be unpacked, and it's controversial in the sense that some people have argued that Anglophone countries are also EMI countries. For example, if you've got a very large group of non-L1 English-speaking students in your science class in Birmingham, then that becomes an EMI class. Well, fine, that people can have that opinion if they wish. I would argue against it on the basis of policy decisions. And policy decisions then also relate to my classification of EMI subjects into what I've called hardcore EMI and soft EMI, or policy-led and language-led. So in the left-hand column, all those subjects are perfectly possible, they can be perfectly possibly taught. That's not very good English. They can be perfectly well taught, that's it. They can be perfectly well taught in the L1 in the vast majority of countries and jurisdictions. Yes, there may be some problem about the availability of material, of research material, but in the end, if in China they're deciding to teach engineering through English, that is a policy decision. Similarly, if in Latin America they decide to use to teach sociology through the medium of English, that is a policy decision. They don't have to do it, and so that does make a difference with the Anglophone context, I think, because people aren't making policy decisions to teach through the medium of English in Birmingham. Now, on the other side, we have what I call kind of language-led subjects, international business and so forth, where as you go down, particularly as you go down the list, you'll find it increasingly difficult not to have reference to English. And in fact, it gets almost impossible by the time you get to Anglophone literature and TESOL not to have overwhelming reference to English. And I think that's important when we think about strategies, because it will lead to language implications, but of course also strategy use implications. How do students become strategic in those different subjects? So one of the overarching questions then for EMI and strategy work is, how is strategic behaviour going to change, excuse me, in different contexts? And so we've got a continuum there of language dominant objectives to content dominant objectives, and clearly what we're looking at is EMI. How do strategies change? How does that strategic behaviour change? How does the good language learner change in those different contexts? Now, I said that strategies were goal-orientated or goal-oriented, and I think that's something that we need to think about, yes. So we need to think about a theoretical approach to eliciting strategic behaviour in an EMI or a content and language integrated language context. So the first question one might be asking is, when you're listening to your teacher in your biology class lesson, do you think more are you thinking more about biology, or are you thinking more about the language of the English she's using? And that might be an overarching question we would want to ask, find out where they are first, yeah? Then we might say, well, what are the listening strategies that you use in your biology lesson? Stressing the word biology lesson. Then we might say, do you listen out for the teacher's discourse markers? And then we might say, how do you deal with teacher intelligibility issues? And so you're framing it much more in an EMI context. And incidentally, I haven't mentioned that there's been very little research on strategy use in EMI and CLIL context so far out there. And I think part of the problem is people are struggling with where to start conceptualizing how to actually elicit strategies from students in those contexts. How am I doing? Okay. So we did a study in Italy, and we looked at students in secondary and tertiary education, and we asked them, when you walk into a classroom, what are you focusing on more? Are you focusing on content, or are you focusing on the language that's being used? Not surprisingly, vast majority of them said, yeah, we think about the content really, and the language is there as the vehicle through which we learn, but we're really focusing on the content. And so when we started attempting to devise, and I say this is still, I think still embryonic in terms of how we go about eliciting strategies, we went for fairly big, more what I've called in earlier on studies skills, kind of mixed up a bit with strategies as well. But you can see here that those students said that those were the things they did tend to do quite a lot. They made notes of keywords, made notes of explanations. They were aware of the difference between the different types of vocabulary. They tried to guess meaning, and so on. But noticing that most of those were during the lesson. In other words, they were being strategic during the lesson, during the lecture. A little bit afterwards, after the lesson, they were reviewing materials, reviewing notes. But now if we look at the ones they said they didn't do, there was very little strategic behavior before the lesson or the lecture. Excuse me. So previewing notes, topics, vocabulary, or listening to lectures online beforehand, which one would have thought might have been possible. Of course, this was just pre-pandemic, so in a sense, these students were actually in the classroom and not online. The other things that they didn't do very much was during the lesson, asking the teacher to explain and whether any kinds of the different types of vocabulary that the teacher was using. They weren't interacting with the teacher, possibly because the teacher did not allow them to interact with him or her, and so there's not much of an opportunity to be strategic. Doesn't look as if it was a strategic classroom, and we did take videos of it, and in fact they weren't particularly strategic classrooms in terms of interaction. Also, they said they didn't ask for Italian equivalents, so they weren't trying to make those connections with their L1. They didn't ask people to repeat or for clarification either in the L1 or in the L2. And as this student said, I've never studied before in physics, because they came from a non-CLIL background. And they said, I have to translate my technical vocabulary from Italian to English. So, and I guess possibly even from English to Italian. That would be a strategy, but within that, how does the translation process go? That is, and I'm going to come back to this notion of technical vocabulary in a moment, because it's very complex. I said that one part of definition of strategies was knowledge of the topic. And so we talked about the prior knowledge being helpful. Yes, I mean, if I'm reading, I mean, my Spanish is very, very poor, but if I'm reading in a Spanish newspaper a topic which I know quite a lot about, say that, you know, about the UK or about Italy or something, and then I can understand it a lot better than if it's a topic I just don't know anything about. And so prior knowledge of the topic has been demonstrated to be an important strategy that people can use. Can you overuse it? But never mind. So, but when we come to applying prior knowledge of the topic in an EMI context, what do we actually mean? Well, we run into some difficulties there straight away, because is prior knowledge of the topic likely to be more important in an EFL or an EMI context? Well, let's think about the different ways that topics are selected. In an EFL context, texts are selected by the teacher for listening, for example, listening comprehension, because I'm making a comparison with lectures and teacher talk. They tend to be graded for the topic. Teachers don't tend to choose outlandish, weird topics for beginners. They tend to use topics that they're familiar with. Now, in an EMI context, the teacher talk is not graded, the topic, if you like, is not necessarily graded. They tend to follow a topic curriculum, and at HE level, it's not even graded. So, you know, there's a big difference there when you say, okay, use your prior knowledge of the topic to understand what the teacher is saying in EMI. Well, I'm sorry, but you know, we haven't done that topic yet. So how can I use my prior knowledge of the topic? Well, you know, and let me show you another example. If you're in doing a politics course, curriculum, then it's very likely, even if you haven't done politics before you start you embark on that course, you'll have some world knowledge of politics. We all have some world knowledge of politics. We even have some event specific knowledge. Yeah, we have, well, I won't mention particular recent ones. We also might have some personal knowledge of politics. Somebody in the family may have been involved in political activity. And then you will have some academic knowledge where some technical terms may have been used, which aren't used, if you like, by the media. Now, if we have particle physics, using prior knowledge in particle physics is going to be quite difficult. I mean, I've got a tiny bit of world knowledge of particle physics, but, you know, probably pretty minimal. So anything I was going to learn about physics, it would have to be learned knowledge. So again, when you're trying to apply that notion of use prior knowledge in order to understand what the teacher is saying, we have a difference between the different subjects. Another difference there is how you future use of the language, and in an oncology lecture to do with cancer research and treatment, the future use of the language is going to be more complex because yes, you may be talking to other practitioners or other researchers, other doctors, but a lot of the time you're also going to be talking to patients. So the future use of the language will have to be modified because you may well be talking to your patients in your L1 rather than in the language in which you learnt the concept. In an economics lecture, that's probably less likely. Economists just tend to talk to one another. I'm not trying to make a comment there, but the other difference is the low level of abstraction. The soft tissue sarcoma, which is a tumor in soft tissue in the body, has fairly low level of abstraction if you're a medical student, whereas game theory is got a very high level of abstraction in economics. Excuse me. So once again, you know, being strategic may well be dependent on the content or the discipline that you are pursuing. And of course, then when you come to something like mathematics, where a teacher is often writing complex formula like these on the board and talking at the same time, you can imagine the type of language that's being used. Prior knowledge is very important, future use of it, how you're going to deal with it, and so on, is going to be quite complex. So Yeah, I've labeled this slide, "It's good to talk, but are we?" And what I'm trying to say here is that we've done systematic reviews and meta-analyses of strategy instruction. And as I've said, they have tended to be reasonably favorable. And other people, i.e. people in the subject disciplines, particularly in science, have done systematic reviews of strategy instruction in other education subjects. Yeah, but we're not talking to one another. And one of the biggest problems with the EMI, I think, at the moment, is this lack of conversation between applied linguists and content specialists. I think that really needs to be tackled in EMI contexts. Right, then I talked about linguistic knowledge in my definition of strategies, yes, as being important. I mentioned already, is it the linguistic knowledge that leads to strategy use, or is it the other way around? Is it strategy use that leads to language proficiency? So proficiency is a problem generally anyway, because an 18-year-old in an EMI geography class, you know, are they more successful than their peers at understanding what the teacher is saying in English because of their strategic behavior? Yeah, or as I said, is that link between the two things, or does their level of English proficiency give them access to a range of strategies which are restricted or denied someone with a lower level of proficiency? Definitely, language proficiency has always been a bit of a problem anyway. It's always been, you know, it's what a learner can understand or produce at one specific moment, i.e. an exam, regardless of learning trajectory. How did they come, you know, how were they learning that? Did they get lots of help from their parents, or, you know, private tuition or whatever? Regardless of their first language, people don't normally say, oh yeah, you got 6.5 IELTS. Ah, yeah, but your language is this. Or socioeconomic background. Yeah, it's just a snapshot in time. And so how do we deal with that in terms of linking it to, how do we deal with that in terms of linking it to strategic behavior? So the construct of proficiency in strategy research, and particularly in EMI, is best used as an outcome measure rather than an independent variable. I'll talk about that if people want me to in questions. Right, coming back to my definition of strategies again, this time difficulty of the task, well, and linguistic knowledge. Okay, so in any EMI listening task, similar to other listening tasks, you've got linguistic knowledge, which basically comprises of vocabulary, grammar, discourse, pragmatic knowledge, and sociocultural knowledge, maybe a few other things, but those are the primary things you need. Knowledge, that is, not performance. And then you've got what learners do with that knowledge, their strategic behavior, and their content knowledge in EMI, plus any new information. So let's talk about the task as being the teacher lecturing in EMI in English on a particular topic. If the task is reasonably balanced or pitched at the right level, then the students will use their linguistic knowledge plus some strategic behavior in order to overcome any difficulties they have in understanding. However, if the task is made very difficult by the teacher, let's say, assuming content knowledge, assuming linguistic knowledge and ability and proficiency, assuming vocabulary knowledge, etc., 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 then that strategic behavior is going to, you know, be very important, or enough, you know, they're going to have to go work very, very hard to be able to understand what the teacher is saying. The other way around, if the teacher repeats everything over and over again, explains, etc., etc., the linguistic knowledge should be sufficient, and the strategic behavior becomes smaller, less effort involved. So let's think about lexical coverage. This is the this provides some clues as to the vocabulary, the breadth and depth needed by students in different EMI contexts for adequate comprehension. Yeah, lexical coverage is what does the teacher say, what vocabulary does the teacher use, and what vocabulary do the students have at the different levels of vocabulary frequency as well as academic vocabulary. So in our Italy study, we gave students vocab tests. These are the secondary students, by the way. And we tried to match those with the lessons that they were listening to or involved in. And if we take lexical coverage, adequate lexical coverage at 80%, in other words, you need to know 80% of the vocabulary, that at the very least 80% of the vocabulary that the teacher's using, then those students in Italy, in upper secondary CLIL students, 17-year-olds, the last year before university, they did not have sufficient vocabulary to be able to understand what the teacher was saying, not at the adequate understanding level. However, that's just tests alone. We don't know how much effort, strategic effort, they were putting in. We know to some extent because of the kind of results I've given you earlier. But in terms of vocabulary tests alone, they didn't have. And as you can see, this is not that same study, but a different bit of data here. You don't need to read this, but if you look at the kind of language that's being used, and if I help you by putting it in color, you'll see that the technical vocabulary is in red, the non-technical but academic vocabulary, excuse me, is in blue, and then the vernacular or everyday talk is in black. So what you might notice about this is that the technical vocabulary is just repeated over and over again: hydrogen, electrode, 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 and so on. Yeah, sulfate, sulfate, electrode, carbon. Yeah. So there's not a lot of new vocabulary coming in, right? There's a fair bit of academic vocabulary that might cause problems: factual recall, equilibrium, and so. But actually, what might be causing a lot of problem is actually the vernacular things that the teacher is saying. Excuse me. There. Now you're probably thinking, or get it into your head, perfectly happy swimming around, and so on. So let's just think a little bit more about what we mean, or what the students mean, when they say, and they say very often, that the problems they have is with technical vocabulary. So in mathematics, homeomorphism is a technical term, okay, but it's a very complex technical term, and so it's that's merely the technical term which encapsulates the concept. And within that concept, often a teacher will give, or a textbook will give, a definition of the concept. Okay. Now, the question is it that that's causing the problem when students say, I have problem with, with technical language? Or is it the language which is needed for masterful understanding of the concept, which is either given by the teacher through the teacher talk, or by a textbook? And then there are related language which in related concepts which might interfere or enhance the understanding. So what I'm saying is that we need to understand a lot better when in our studies of vocabulary in EMI, students say, I don't understand the technical language. And of course, clearly that's a new finding, isn't it? Because in previous strategy research, when it was language research, we didn't have that. Students weren't saying, I have trouble understanding technical language. Thus, strategic behaviour for learning the word homeomorphism is only going to affect the tip of the iceberg. It's not that they're going to find it difficult to learn the word homeomorphism. I mean, you can probably probably learn that word in about 5 minutes. It's the underlying concepts. So before strategy elicitation, and as I'm trying to make this shift from language learner strategy research to EMI student strategy research, you need to kind of start off perhaps with some kind of needs analysis. So in a geography class, EMI, can a student recognize the way the teacher organizes his or her ideas? Can they see the relationship between the talk and the slides? Can they see the relationship between what she says and the handouts? Distinguishing facts being presented from teacher's opinion? Understand the questions asked by fellow students. So first of all, that's a kind of general, I would suggest, approach to strategy instruction. First of all, some kind of needs analysis of where they're having difficulty. And going down a bit more, do they understand the procedural instruction the teacher gives, how to carry out a task, identify the technical words, can they identify technical words that the teacher's using from other words? And can they understand the general academic words and distinguish them from technical words and from everyday vocabulary? Any idiomatic language such as, you'll get this right, I'll be over the moon. So before we can be confident that we've got anywhere near a taxonomy of EMI strategies that students can use or have access to or think about, we've got to do a lot of thinking first. And so what I suggest is we need a research agenda built around some of the components in my two definitions that I've given you and repeatedly gone back to in this talk, that learner strategy definition, looking at the various components of that, and then in the EMI definition that I've also proposed. That will then help us to come eventually to some kind of model of strategy use in EMI. Anyway, this is the model I'm currently working with and thinking about. And if you look at the left-hand side first, we need to think about linguistic knowledge. What is the linguistic knowledge that students in their EMI contexts have or need? And I think I've tried to differentiate between different disciplines. Knowledge of the topic. Again, I've tried to differentiate between different disciplines. Then there's the task difficulty variation, and just a general task difficulty procedure. Finally, we have opportunities for strategic behavior in and out of class. Well, in class, that may well be regulated by what the teacher allows, whereas out of class, the students will have more autonomy in deciding on their strategic behavior. And then we can start to compose some kind of a list of EMI strategies, of which I guess some will be generic or general to all subjects or all disciplines, and then some will be subject specific. So that's my learner strategy in EMI listening context, and that's just listening, by the way, listening context model I'm trying to work with, struggling with. And so thank you for listening. And I've given a few references here that I've mentioned in the talk. I think I'm a few minutes early.
You've done brilliantly. Thank you so much, Ernesto. I mean, I was kind of interested to see how this was going to comprehensively cover these ideas. Like in my mind, I felt like there was a lot here to do in a short talk, but you managed.
Well, I hope so. There was too much probably, and I was going very fast. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a basis for further discussion.
Right. For sure. And I think that's, we're getting that in the chat. So we've got lots of really good questions. I'm going to try to group them and present them to you, because we've got some questions in relation to language learning strategies. We've got some questions specific to EMI and researching EMI. And I think probably no surprise, definitions of EMI as well, that people are interested in your take on that. So just to start with some of the questions on language learning strategies, the very first question that came in was an interesting one. It was about how you see the role of global Englishes in language learning strategies. Any comments on that?
Wow. Okay. Well, clearly, if you're researching language, eliciting strategies from students, you need to know the context in which those strategies are, even if it's just language. So, which variety of English is being used, and also the the students' reactions to varieties of English. You'd need to know that they're not kind of shunning certain varieties and therefore not being strategic in trying to understand them. You need to know their attitudes towards the varieties, because also in learning the language, they're going to put more strategic effort into those varieties that they are accepting and less into the ones that they're rejecting. So, I mean, I'm not an expert on global Englishes or varieties of English, but I mean, I would think that if you're going to motivate students, or if students are going to motivate themselves, they're going to motivate themselves for things they want to learn.
Yeah. I really appreciate that response, because I think people are interested in this sort of which English, what E are we talking about in EMI? And so the people doing research in global Englishes, looking at, there was a shared article from Wakamoto and Rose that just came out. It's actually the December issue of System, looking at global Englishes and language learning strategies for listening. So I mean, it is interesting to see, that, and I think you're right, it is around this idea about kind of motivating and kind of clarifying for students, what works and what doesn't work with what English. Other questions in relation to language learning strategies. There was an interesting question about which strategies are effective, and this was in response to a comment that Tim made about how research seems to focus on how strategies are applied rather than on their effectiveness.
How they're applied rather than their effectiveness. Well, it's very difficult to measure directly effectiveness. And as I said, the evidence we have from strategy training or strategy instruction is that it does seem to help move students on. I mean, Suzanne Graham and I did a study about listening strategies in English schools at sixth form level. And there was quite a considerable improvement. There was a significant improvement in listening ability. So I mean, I don't think we can pinpoint a strategy, a single strategy, and saying this is good, this is and another one is bad. Some people say, oh, rote learning is a bad idea. Well, rote learning can be a good idea if you combine it with something else. And so that's why I always talk about combinations of strategies. If you go back to the definition, it's certain combinations of strategies applied to a particular situation, a particular task, will be more successful. Coming back to listening again, or even reading. If you're reading a topic, a story in a newspaper or whatever, there's really an area that you don't know anything about, you're going to have to be, it's not much good saying, okay, I'm going to look up every word, Yeah. You'd have to sort of sit back and think, what is the general topic, and what is the general story here? What is it that they're trying to tell me? And then trying to work out, the structure in some way. If you know most of the words, then you can say, okay, I don't know that word. I'll look one up and then I'll know everything. So, you've got to adapt your combination of strategies to the situation, to the task. And so I don't think there's any one strategy which is brilliant and any one strategy which is rubbish. Because, for example, the one I gave before, the keyword strategy, well, that can take quite a lot of time. And in some situations, trying to think of, making a little story about a tap and a cork can take quite a bit of time. So it may not be the right thing to do at that time, but it is something which is available to you. But you've got to make that metacognitive judgment.
and I guess that's the idea, right? It's different contexts are going to require different types of metacognitive judgment. Therefore, different strategies are going to play their role. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that's good. And that covers a few of the other questions too. I'm going to segue some of this into now questions on EMI, and this is about. There's some interesting questions here about students' resistance to asking questions in class. Can that be linked to extroverted personalities? That was the first question in relation to that. What do you think about that?
Oh, sorry. Okay. Well, it may be. It may be the personality thing. But then you've got to see if it's a strategic classroom, first of all. First of all, you've got to establish through observation, recording, or whatever, whether the teacher is inviting students to ask questions or not. And to be honest, if we look at the transcriptions of the Italy project, or in fact most other stuff that I've done on EMI talk, teacher talk, there's not that many invitations to ask questions, and so I don't know whether students are cowed into not wanting to ask questions. They don't feel confident, or whether it's they don't feel confident about the language, or they don't feel confident about the topic. They may think, oh, I don't know enough about the topic to ask the question, or they haven't got the language. And so yeah, I mean, extrovert, introvert may be a differentiating variable, but I don't know. I don't know if it's the most important one. I can imagine it more being whether the teacher is actually interacting with the students, giving the confidence. I mean, I've done a couple of studies in China where one teacher was really trying very hard to interact more with the students. The other teacher decided not to, and so if there isn't that opportunity to interact, you're not going to be feeling very extrovert. Whether you're extrovert or not, you're not going to feel very confident about asking questions. Can I just say one more very brief thing about that? I'm also interested in that kind of interaction in EMI is how many verbs in a transcript students are using. And the reason I'm interested in verbs is because verbs can't be used on their own, whereas nouns can. So a teacher can talk for about 3 minutes, then ask a question which requires a one noun answer, but you can't use a verb on its own, or very rarely. You will have to use a verb phrase. And in using a verb phrase, you're expressing concepts a lot more, particularly in science, you're expressing processes. And so, you've got to create that environment where students feel confident to have a go, because I mean, verb phrases are most difficult in English.
Yeah. No, this is good, because it's interesting thinking about, where some of the resistance lies. I thought it was really nice, because this is part of the helpful segue here, was the question posted by John Simpson, where he was asking, well, is it possible that kind of hesitation is because the students are focused on content? So thinking about, EMI contexts, saying, maybe they're not comfortable asking language related questions, or maybe they don't expect content teachers to answer such questions. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think it comes back to my knowledge of the topic, depending on a completely new topic. They're not going to be asking questions very easily, because they don't know how to ask, they don't know how to formulate the background knowledge to the particular topic. If it's a neat continuation, so say in a physics lecture from a previous topic, then they're going to be able to rely on that earlier knowledge of the topic to be able to ask a sensible question, if you like. So yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything specific at the moment. I haven't got the evidence, but my gut feeling is I don't think there's anything specific about being in a content class which stops you asking a question. I can't see that unless the teacher, you've got the kind of teacher who says, well, why are you asking me that question? You should have learned about that last week or something. It's all about the relationship.
I'm not your language teacher.
Yeah, I mean, why are you asking me about verbs? Okay, adverbs. I've taught you that last week.
This is good, because it links to it was actually a later question, but I really appreciate it. The question is, are the terms EMI and CLIL interchangeable?
No, well, oh, big problem here. Okay, well, they're not interchangeable in the sense that they are attempting different things, if you like. So in English medium instruction, particularly in university context, and of course, in certain jurisdictions, they are used in secondary education and not so much in primary, but in secondary as well. EMI is used. Basically, in the term, there is nothing there to suggest that the teacher is concerned with students' language. I mean, it's English medium instruction or English medium education. And what it's basically saying, this subject or this discipline is going to be taught at least partially through the medium of English. Of course, there are different models of EMI, whereby it could be bilingual, it could be one module might be in English, another module might be in Arabic or whatever. But there's nothing written into the EMI formula, if you like, that suggests it's the teacher's responsibility to teach English, to teach the language, or to facilitate language learning or facilitate comprehension. In CLIL, it's actually in the acronym, isn't it? Content and language. You're trying to integrate the two things. However, I would have to say that, in the research so far on CLIL, there's not that much evidence that language is being integrated. I mean, because it's lower down, because it's in general education, secondary education, or whatever we want to call it, it's more likely, and because the classes are smaller, that a student's going to say and the student notices and says, okay, I'm going to try and help her with that bit of language, or I'm going to actually teach you these verb phrases because you need to use them or whatever. But I don't, so I don't think they're interchangeable in that sense. No, I would actually, sorry, just to make sure, I would actually use EMI as the umbrella term, to be perfectly honest. And then below that, you've got CLIL, where there is some, teaching of language.
Just reminding me of the continuum, right? With this idea of EMI at one end and language teaching at the other end. But that's that's a CLIL continuum more than an EMI continuum, but we see things called EMI further down that continuum depending
they're
on
very much at the content end.
I
think most teachers say, look, I'm not a language teacher, I haven't got time, I'm expected to do research into astrophysics, otherwise I get the boot.
Right. And it's hard enough to be publishing on the topic, let alone
But nevertheless, if you take, having said that, if you're taking on the responsibility of EMI, then and that's a whole other discussion about professional development. I think you should feel responsible to at least do the best kind of teaching possible to allow the students to thrive.
No, I like that kind of takeaway. All right, a couple of other questions about the definitions of EMI, thinking about the scope of the definition of Anglophone countries. So would that include countries in particular context, capital cities of Nigeria or Ghana?
Clearly that is a bit of a gray area in the definition. I think one of the, as you're alluding to, really, one of the reasons that English is the medium of instruction in countries such as Nigeria is that there are so many national languages, and therefore it becomes a lingua franca rather and clearly the national language in South Africa and so on. And so yes, it's difficult though. They're kind of halfway, aren't they? Halfway, I would think. I think we need more research into those countries and to sort of see whether they are distinct environments from Anglophone, i.e., my example of Birmingham in the UK, or learning English instruction in Istanbul.
Right. Actually, the example of Birmingham actually, I think, sparked another question, because it was about, with the internationalization of Anglophone country classrooms, would you consider reviewing or adjusting the definition of EMI?
I don't really understand the question. The internationalization
of Anglophone country classrooms.
Oh, I
so
see.
where
So
we're seeing,
well, that's exactly what I was arguing against.
yeah,
The definition for me works because of the policy decision. And if you're making policy decisions, then you have to, make a lot of other decisions about implementation, facilitation, professional development on the other hand. Now, it could be that internationalization of classrooms in Anglophone countries, of course, teachers should be aware of that, but the policy decision is not being made at any other kind of level, I think. And so, having said that, can I just say, that doesn't mean we can't compare.
Right.
That doesn't mean we can't compare a multilingual audience in Birmingham, UK, with a multilingual or even not a particularly multilingual one in Beijing. So I think you can still make comparisons, but it's if you don't keep them slightly separate, then you're going to lose that kind of policy and politics aspect. Which I think is very, very important, really. And the whole argument about whether EMI is affecting the local language, in the Philippines or in Indonesia or in Sri Lanka, to what extent that's going to, if you lump everything together, then you're not going to be able to make those sorts of, you can compare them, but I think to still keep them apart.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I think, being able to delineate based on policy is probably the right way to go.
Yeah.
Other really interesting questions, but we're out of time. And I think, a lot of the questions that were really good, they're really focused on, a lot of this kind of EMI in practice and kind of how to deal with negotiating or the challenges for content teachers and language specialist teachers, looking for kind of, I think models and ideal curriculum. And I think this is maybe where things get a bit tough, and it's hard to respond to some of these questions because it all depends, right? I mean, education level, as you said already, right, is part of the issue, but then different policies, right, kind of guiding curriculum.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of quickly come in on that. I mean, in the end, it comes down to money. If an institution, a university, or even a school wants to really do it well, then they're going to have to put some money into it, and give professional development provide professional development to the teachers, or B, reduce class sizes, or C, do some bilingual. They've got to have to. You can't just say, all right, off you go. And that really is not acceptable. So yeah, there are resource implications.
Yeah. And I think that's the part that I think maybe gets missed a bit. I've switched up the screen there. I just really want to say thank you very much, Professor Ernesto Macaro, for an absolutely wonderful seminar and really engaging Q&A session. That was very, very active. I did my best, everyone. Sorry, I know there were still questions coming into the chat while we were going through the Q&A session. But yeah, I think there are definitely some good opportunities to engage, in this discussion. There's obviously a lot of pressing questions around this and questions about how research can really help to inform practices, which I think is really good as well. So thank you. I'm just sharing my screen really quickly just to kind of show you that we do have some other talks coming up. So please note in your calendars, and the announcement will go out again on Ball Mail and on other networks, that 1 week from today, on the 3rd of November, is Dr. Beatriz Gonzalez Fernandez, who will be talking about understanding the nature and acquisition of vocabulary knowledge in second languages, which relates to some of the questions that you had today. So please do make sure that you attend that. And I will stop the